In the heart of London stands one of the most magnificent palaces in the world, its golden gates gleaming under the British sun, its 775 rooms echoing with centuries of royal history. Tourists gather daily, cameras clicking, hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty behind those famous windows. But here's what they don't know: the man who now wears the crown, King Charles III, cannot truly call this iconic palace his home. This isn't a tale of royal rebellion or family drama. It's something far more complex, woven into the very fabric of modern monarchy, constitutional law, and the weight of tradition that has shaped the British royal family for generations. Behind the ceremonial splendor and public appearances lies a story that reveals the true cost of wearing the crown, a cost that even the King of England must pay. What forces could be powerful enough to keep a king from his own palace? What secrets lie buried in the ancient traditions of the monarchy that even today's modern world cannot overturn? The answer will surprise you, challenge everything you thought you knew about royal life, and reveal why being king might be the loneliest job in the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawns of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III stood at the window of what should have been his private study. The irony wasn't lost on him that he could see his kingdom from these windows but couldn't truly live within these walls. At 75 years old, after waiting longer than any heir in British history, he had finally achieved his destiny, only to discover that the crown came with invisible chains he never anticipated. Charles had always known this day would come. For decades, he had prepared for the moment when he would transition from the Prince of Wales to the King of England. He had studied constitutional law, met with prime ministers, and understood the weight of responsibility that would rest upon his shoulders. But no amount of preparation had readied him for the complex web of traditions, security protocols, and constitutional requirements that would effectively exile him from the palace he was supposed to call home. The transformation began immediately after his mother's funeral. Queen Elizabeth II had lived in Buckingham Palace for most of her 70-year reign, making it not just the administrative center of the monarchy but a true family residence. The Queen's personal apartments had been her sanctuary, filled with her own furniture, her beloved dogs, and decades of personal memories. But when Charles ascended to the throne, everything changed overnight. The first shock came from the security briefings. The world had become a far more dangerous place than when his mother first moved into the palace in 1952. Modern terrorist threats, cyber warfare, and the constant scrutiny of social media had created a security environment that made traditional royal residence nearly impossible. The head of royal protection explained to Charles that Buckingham Palace, despite its grandeur, was essentially a security nightmare in the modern age. The palace sits in the heart of London, surrounded by busy streets, tourist attractions, and public spaces that make it impossible to create the kind of security perimeter required for a modern head of state. Unlike the White House, which has extensive grounds and multiple layers of security, Buckingham Palace is accessible from multiple directions, with its famous front gate just yards away from one of London's busiest thoroughfares. The security concerns went beyond simple protection from physical threats. The palace's aging infrastructure made it vulnerable to electronic surveillance, cyber attacks, and other forms of modern espionage. The building's historic nature meant that installing contemporary security systems would require extensive renovations that could take years to complete and would fundamentally alter the character of the building that millions of people around the world recognized as the symbol of the British monarchy. Charles learned that his mother had actually spent much of her later years living primarily at Windsor Castle, using Buckingham Palace mainly for official functions and state visits. But even Windsor Castle presented its own challenges. The castle, while more secure and private, was equally steeped in tradition and protocol that made normal family life virtually impossible. The second major obstacle came from Parliament and the constitutional experts who advised the Crown. The British monarchy operates under an intricate system of constitutional monarchy that has evolved over centuries. Unlike absolute monarchies, the British sovereign's role is largely ceremonial and symbolic, but this symbolic nature comes with its own set of restrictions and obligations. Constitutional law requires that the monarch be available for government consultation at specific times and in specific ways. The palace serves not just as a residence but as the working headquarters of the constitutional monarchy. Every day brings a stream of government officials, foreign dignitaries, and constitutional obligations that require the king's presence and attention. The red boxes arrive daily, filled with government documents that required the royal assent or review. These aren't ceremonial gestures but actual constitutional requirements that form part of the governance of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth realms. Charles discovered that his schedule would be dictated not by personal preference but by constitutional necessity. The third challenge was perhaps the most personal, the transformation of his relationship with his own family. As king, Charles's interactions with his sons, William and Harry, and his grandchildren would no longer be governed by normal family dynamics but by the protocols of the monarchy. Even private family gatherings would require security clearances, advance planning, and official protocols. His relationship with Camilla, now queen consort, faced similar challenges. While they had enjoyed a relatively normal married life before his accession to the throne, their new roles brought with them a level of public scrutiny and official responsibility that made private moments increasingly rare and precious. The palace staff, numbering in the hundreds, operated according to traditions that dated back centuries. Every aspect of royal life was governed by protocol, from the clothes the king wore to the meals he ate to the people he could meet privately. Charles found himself living in a world where spontaneity was impossible and privacy was a luxury he could no longer afford. The financial aspects of royal life also played a role in limiting Charles's freedom. The Crown Estate, which generates revenue for the government, operates under strict guidelines about how royal properties can be used and modified. Any changes to Buckingham Palace would require approval from multiple government departments and could take years to implement. Charles also faced the reality that as a constitutional monarch, he was expected to remain politically neutral in all matters. This meant that many of the causes he had championed as Prince of Wales, from environmental conservation to architectural preservation, would now have to be approached differently or abandoned altogether. His voice, once influential in matters of public policy, was now constrained by the requirements of royal neutrality. The media attention that came with being king created another layer of isolation. Every movement, every decision, every public appearance was scrutinized and analyzed by a press corps that had grown increasingly invasive over the decades. The palace had become a fishbowl, with telephoto lenses and satellite dishes creating a constant state of surveillance that made normal life impossible. Perhaps most poignantly, Charles realized that the palace that should have been his crown jewel had instead become his most beautiful prison. The building that represented the pinnacle of his family's power and prestige was also the symbol of everything he had been forced to sacrifice in order to wear the crown. As he stood at that window, looking out over the London skyline, Charles understood that his mother's long reign had been not just a period of service to the nation but a lifetime of personal sacrifice that he was now expected to continue. The crown had given him everything he had been born to expect, and simultaneously taken away everything that made life meaningful on a personal level. The palace would always be his in name, but it would never truly be his home. This was the first lesson of his reign, and perhaps the most difficult one to accept. The ancient traditions that governed royal life weren't merely ceremonial customs that could be discarded at will. They formed the very foundation of the constitutional monarchy, and Charles quickly discovered that challenging them would mean challenging the entire system that had sustained the British crown for over 1,000 years. The morning routine alone demonstrated how thoroughly tradition controlled every aspect of his existence. Charles had always been an early riser, preferring to start his day with quiet reflection and personal time. But, as king, his mornings began with the ceremonial wake, a tradition dating back to medieval times when the sovereign's safety through the night needed to be confirmed to the court. A series of officials would arrive at precisely scheduled intervals, each carrying out duties that had been performed in essentially the same manner for centuries. The keeper of the privy purse would arrive with the night's security reports. The private secretary would present the day's official schedule, which had been planned weeks or sometimes months in advance. The equerry would brief him on military matters requiring royal attention. These weren't brief updates that Charles could handle over coffee while reading the morning papers. Each briefing followed ancient protocols that required his full attention and formal responses. The king couldn't simply nod and move on. Constitutional monarchy demanded that he demonstrate active engagement with every aspect of governance that touched upon the crown's responsibilities. The breakfast itself followed rules that seemed absurd to modern sensibilities but carried deep constitutional significance. The monarch's meals were prepared according to security protocols that dated back to times when poisoning was a real and constant threat. Every ingredient was sourced from approved suppliers, prepared by vetted staff, and served using specific china and silverware that were part of the crown's official regalia. Charles found himself eating alone more often than not because he preferred solitude, but because sharing meals required advanced security clearance for every guest, official approval from his private secretary's office, and adherence to seating protocols that determined who could sit where based on their position in the official hierarchy of the royal household. The clothing protocols proved equally restrictive. As Prince of Wales, Charles had enjoyed the freedom to wear what he pleased during private moments, often favoring comfortable country clothes that reflected his love of rural life. As king, every public appearance required specific regalia, and even his private moments were governed by dress codes that reflected the dignity of the crown. The traditional morning wear, afternoon dress, and evening attire weren't choices but requirements. Each outfit carried symbolic meaning that communicated messages about the monarchy's relationship with various institutions, foreign governments, and British society. Charles couldn't simply put on a comfortable sweater. Everything he wore was a statement about the crown's position on matters ranging from military support to cultural values. The daily schedule revealed how completely tradition had consumed his freedom. The monarch's time wasn't his own but belonged to the nation and the Commonwealth. Constitutional requirements meant that specific hours each day were reserved for government consultation, during which Charles had to be available to meet with the Prime Minister, review legislation, and handle matters of state that required royal attention. The tradition of the daily audiences meant that Charles would meet with a stream of officials, dignitaries, and representatives who had scheduled appointments weeks or months in advance. These weren't casual conversations but formal meetings conducted according to protocols that determined everything from how people entered the room to where they stood to how they addressed the king. Each audience required preparation. Charles had to be briefed in advance about every person he would meet, their background, the purpose of their visit, and the appropriate responses to expected topics of conversation. Spontaneous discussion was discouraged because it could lead to statements that might be interpreted as political positions, which would violate the monarch's constitutional requirement to remain politically neutral. The tradition of royal correspondence consumed hours each day. Thousands of letters arrived at the palace weekly, from government officials, foreign heads of state, Commonwealth leaders, and private citizens. Constitutional tradition required that significant correspondence receive personal attention from the monarch, not merely automatic responses from staff members. Charles discovered that his mother had spent several hours each day reading and responding to correspondence, a practice that couldn't simply be delegated to staff because it formed part of the monarch's constitutional duty to remain informed about the concerns and opinions of the people. Each response had to be carefully crafted to avoid political positions while still acknowledging the writer's concerns. The ancient tradition of the Privy Council created another layer of obligation that consumed Charles's time and freedom. As king, he was required to attend Privy Council meetings where government ministers formally presented legislation and policy decisions for royal approval. These weren't rubber stamp ceremonies but actual constitutional requirements where the monarch's participation was legally necessary for the governance of the nation. The meetings followed protocols established centuries earlier, complete with formal language, specific seating arrangements, and ceremonial procedures that could not be modified without acts of parliament. Charles found himself spending hours in meetings where every word was prescribed by tradition and every gesture carried constitutional significance. Religious obligations formed another immovable component of royal life. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, Charles was required to participate in religious ceremonies, meet with church leaders, and maintain the crown's relationship with the established church. These weren't optional activities but constitutional duties that came with the throne. The traditional church services, religious festivals, and ceremonial observances filled large portions of Charles's calendar throughout the year. Each event required not just his presence but his active participation in ceremonies that followed scripts written centuries earlier. The king couldn't simply attend, he had to perform specific roles that demonstrated the monarchy's commitment to the established church. State dinners and official entertainment revealed how thoroughly tradition controlled even social activities. When Charles hosted foreign dignitaries or government officials, every aspect of the evening followed protocols that determined the guest list, seating arrangements, menu selection, and entertainment options. These weren't parties but diplomatic events where every detail carried political and cultural significance. The preparation for these events required days of planning by dozens of staff members, each responsible for ensuring that traditional protocols were followed perfectly. Charles couldn't simply invite people he enjoyed spending time with. Guest lists were determined by diplomatic necessity, constitutional requirements, and traditional precedents that sometimes dated back decades or centuries. The royal travel traditions proved equally restrictive. When Charles needed to travel within the United Kingdom or internationally, the logistics involved weren't just about transportation and accommodation but about maintaining the dignity and security of the crown while honoring traditional relationships with local officials and institutions. Every trip required advance teams to prepare venues according to royal protocols, coordinate with local security forces, and ensure that traditional ceremonial elements were properly arranged. Charles couldn't simply decide to visit a place. Royal travel required months of planning and formal approval from multiple government departments. The traditional gift-giving customs created another layer of obligation. As king, Charles was expected to exchange gifts with foreign leaders, present honors to deserving citizens, and maintain relationships with hundreds of organizations and institutions through ceremonial presentations. These weren't personal choices but constitutional duties that required careful consideration of diplomatic implications and traditional precedents. Perhaps most significantly, the tradition of royal neutrality meant that Charles had to abandon many of the personal interests and public positions that had defined his identity as Prince of Wales. His passionate advocacy for environmental causes, architectural preservation, and social issues couldn't continue in the same manner because kings weren't permitted to express personal opinions on matters of public policy. This wasn't just about avoiding controversial topics, it meant that Charles had to fundamentally alter his personality and public identity to conform to the traditional role of the constitutional monarch. The man who had spent decades speaking out on issues he cared about deeply had to become a figure who expressed no personal opinions and took no public positions on the major issues of the day. The cumulative effect of these traditions was the complete transformation of Charles's daily existence from that of a person who happened to be royal into that of a living symbol who happened to be human. Every moment of his day was governed by protocols designed to maintain the dignity and continuity of an institution that had evolved over centuries but could not be rapidly modernized without risking its fundamental character and constitutional role. The security apparatus that surrounded King Charles III represented one of the most sophisticated protection systems in the world, but it also created an invisible cage that separated him from normal human experience in ways that would have been unimaginable to previous generations of monarchs. The transformation began with the physical spaces Charles could occupy. Every room he entered had to be swept by security teams using equipment that could detect everything from explosive devices to electronic surveillance equipment. This wasn't a quick check but a thorough process that could take hours and required the temporary evacuation of entire sections of any building he planned to visit. The security protocols meant that Charles couldn't simply decide to move from one room to another within Buckingham Palace. Even within his own supposed home, his movements had to be coordinated with security teams, announced in advance to household staff, and logged by protection officers who tracked his location at all times. The spontaneous walk through the palace gardens that his mother had enjoyed in earlier decades was now impossible due to the security requirements of the modern age. The electronic surveillance that surrounded the king created another layer of separation from normal life. Every phone call was monitored by security services, not for purposes of censorship but to protect against electronic eavesdropping by foreign intelligence services. Charles discovered that he couldn't have a private conversation with anyone, including his own family members, without the knowledge that security personnel were listening to ensure that state secrets weren't compromised and that potential threats were identified. The protection officers assigned to Charles weren't simply bodyguards but highly trained specialists who accompanied him everywhere. These men and women became the closest thing to friends that the king could have, yet their primary loyalty was to his safety rather than his personal happiness. They were trained to view every situation as a potential threat and every person as a possible danger, creating an atmosphere of constant tension that made relaxation impossible. The security requirements extended to everyone who came into contact with Charles. Family members, old friends, household staff, and government officials all had to undergo background checks and security clearances before they could spend time with the king. This meant that Charles couldn't maintain casual relationships with people from his past or develop new friendships with individuals who hadn't been vetted by security services. The process of security clearance could take weeks or months, during which potential visitors were investigated by intelligence services that examined their financial records, personal relationships, travel history, and political affiliations. Many people who had been close to Charles before his accession to the throne found themselves unable to maintain those relationships because they couldn't or wouldn't submit to the intrusive background investigations required for continued contact with the king. The transportation security protocols created another barrier between Charles and normal experience. The king couldn't simply get in a car and drive somewhere or take public transportation or even walk down a London street without elaborate advance preparation involving multiple security agencies, local police forces, and emergency services. Every journey, no matter how short, required route planning that considered potential threats, escape routes, hospital locations, and communication requirements. The famous royal motorcade wasn't just ceremonial but a mobile security operation involving dozens of vehicles, hundreds of personnel, and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. The security requirements meant that Charles couldn't experience London as a normal resident of the city. He couldn't visit restaurants without advanced security sweeps that would clear the establishment of other customers. He couldn't attend theater performances or sporting events without security arrangements that fundamentally altered the nature of those experiences for everyone involved. The digital security protocols proved equally isolating. Charles's internet access was filtered through security systems designed to prevent cyber attacks and protect against electronic surveillance. He couldn't browse websites freely, participate in social media, or communicate electronically without security oversight that monitored every digital interaction for potential threats. The king's emails were processed through security systems that scanned for malware, tracked their origins, and maintained records of all electronic communications. Charles discovered that he had less digital privacy than ordinary citizens, despite his exalted position, because the security requirements of modern monarchy demanded constant surveillance of all forms of communication. The medical security protocols revealed another dimension of how thoroughly protection requirements had invaded every aspect of royal life. Charles's healthcare wasn't just about maintaining his physical well-being but about protecting state secrets and ensuring continuity of government. His medical records were classified documents, his physicians underwent security clearances, and even routine medical appointments required security arrangements that made normal patient-doctor relationships impossible. The food security requirements created daily reminders of how different royal life had become from normal human experience. Every meal Charles ate was prepared according to security protocols that traced ingredients from their sources through every step of preparation and service. The king couldn't eat at restaurants without advanced security preparations, couldn't accept food gifts from well-wishers, and couldn't even enjoy home-cooked meals prepared by friends or family members without security oversight. The communication security protocols meant that Charles couldn't use normal phones, email systems, or messaging services. All of his communications had to go through secured systems that were monitored by intelligence services and protected against foreign surveillance. This created delays and complications that made simple conversations with family members feel like diplomatic negotiations. The social media restrictions proved particularly isolating for a man who had grown accustomed to engaging with the public on issues he cared about. As king, Charles couldn't maintain personal social media accounts, couldn't respond directly to public criticism or praise, and couldn't use digital platforms to communicate his thoughts and opinions to the public without approval from government officials and security services. The security requirements for public appearances transformed what should have been opportunities to connect with his subjects into carefully orchestrated events that created distance rather than intimacy. Every public appearance required advanced security sweeps, controlled access for spectators, predetermined routes and schedules, and emergency response preparations that turned royal visits into military-style operations. The spontaneous interactions with members of the public that had made his mother's reign so memorable became impossible due to security concerns. Charles couldn't stop to chat with people he encountered during official visits, couldn't respond to invitations from local organizations, and couldn't extend his stays in places he enjoyed visiting because security arrangements were planned with precise timing and couldn't be modified without extensive replanning. The security protocols for international travel elevated protection requirements to the level of those surrounding heads of state in wartime. Charles couldn't visit foreign countries without coordination between British intelligence services, foreign security agencies, and international law enforcement organizations. Every international trip became a diplomatic event that required months of planning and created significant expenses for both British taxpayers and host countries. The personal relationships that Charles had cherished before becoming king became casualties of security requirements. Old friends found themselves unable to maintain contact because they couldn't undergo security clearances or because the complications of meeting with the king made casual friendships impossible to sustain. The relationship with his sons, William and Harry, was transformed by security protocols that required advance planning for family gatherings and made spontaneous visits impossible. Even phone conversations with his children were subject to security monitoring, and their ability to visit him was constrained by protection requirements that treated every family member as a potential security risk. The security requirements created a paradox at the heart of modern monarchy. The more elaborate the protection became, the more isolated the king became from the people he was supposed to serve. The systems designed to keep him safe also kept him separate from normal human experience, creating a barrier between the monarch and his subjects that undermined the very relationship that justified the monarchy's existence. Charles found himself living in a world where safety had become more important than happiness, where protection had become more significant than personal relationships, and where security had created a form of imprisonment that was more complete and inescapable than any physical jail. The crown had made him the most protected person in the kingdom and, simultaneously, the most isolated human being in British society. The most heartbreaking aspect of King Charles III's predicament wasn't the loss of personal freedom or the burden of constitutional duty, but the way his new role had fundamentally altered his relationships with the people he loved most. The crown that should have represented the pinnacle of his family's legacy had instead become a barrier that separated him from his children, grandchildren, and wife in ways that no amount of wealth or power could overcome. The relationship with his elder son, Prince William, had transformed overnight from that of father and son to that of monarch and heir apparent. The easy conversations they had enjoyed when Charles was Prince of Wales were now filtered through the constitutional requirements of the succession. William couldn't simply call his father to chat about family matters or personal concerns. Every interaction between them carried the weight of preparing for the future of the monarchy. The private family dinners that had once provided opportunities for honest conversation about the challenges of royal life became formal briefings where Charles had to prepare William for his future role as king. The father who had once offered personal advice and emotional support to his son was now required to maintain the constitutional relationship between monarch and heir that put duty above personal feelings. William's own children, Charles's grandchildren, became symbols of the monarchy's future rather than simply beloved family members. Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis couldn't visit their grandfather without security arrangements that made spontaneous visits impossible. The grandfather who wanted to take his grandchildren for walks in the gardens or teach them about nature was constrained by protection protocols that treated every family gathering as a potential security risk. The relationship with Prince Harry represented an even more painful transformation. Harry's decision to step back from royal duties and move to California had already created distance between him and his father, but Charles's accession to the throne made reconciliation exponentially more complicated. As king, Charles couldn't simply forgive and forget. Every decision about Harry's role in the family carried constitutional implications that affected the monarchy's relationship with Parliament, the Commonwealth, and the British public. The private conversations between father and son that might have healed their relationship were now subject to security monitoring and constitutional oversight. Charles couldn't simply call Harry to express his love and concern because any communication between the king and his estranged son could be interpreted as official royal policy. The father's desire to reconcile with his son was constrained by the monarch's duty to maintain the dignity and stability of the institution. Harry's children, Archie and Lilibet, represented perhaps the most painful aspect of Charles's isolation. As their grandfather, he wanted to be part of their lives, to watch them grow up, and to share the wisdom and love that grandparents traditionally provide. But the security requirements and constitutional complications made regular contact with his grandchildren in California virtually impossible. The time difference between London and California meant that Charles's rigidly scheduled days rarely allowed for the spontaneous phone calls that grandparents typically enjoy with their grandchildren. When communication was possible, it was filtered through security protocols and diplomatic considerations that made natural conversation difficult if not impossible. Queen Consort Camilla faced her own set of challenges in adapting to their new roles. The woman who had been Charles's companion and supporter throughout their courtship and marriage found herself transformed into a constitutional figure whose every action reflected upon the monarchy. The private jokes, casual conversations, and intimate moments that had sustained their relationship were now constrained by the public scrutiny and official responsibilities that came with being king and queen consort. Their marriage, which had weathered decades of public criticism and media scrutiny, now faced new pressures from within the institution they had worked so hard to serve. Camilla couldn't simply be Charles's wife, she had to be the queen consort, a role that required her to maintain public dignity even when she disagreed with official decisions or wanted to support her husband's personal preferences over constitutional requirements. The couple's shared interests in gardening, reading, and countryside activities became complicated by security requirements and public expectations. They couldn't simply enjoy a quiet evening at home because their home was now a public building with constitutional significance. Their private moments were constrained by the presence of household staff, security personnel, and official obligations that made genuine intimacy increasingly rare. The extended royal family found their relationships with Charles transformed by his new status. Siblings who had once treated him as an equal now had to observe protocols that acknowledged his position as sovereign. Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, and Prince Edward couldn't simply call their brother for family conversations, they had to request audiences through his private secretary's office and observe the formal protocols that governed interactions with the monarch. The traditional family gatherings at Christmas, Easter, and other holidays became state occasions rather than personal celebrations. Family members couldn't simply enjoy each other's company, they had to participate in official ceremonies that were planned by government officials and conducted according to constitutional requirements. The spontaneous family conversations that had once provided emotional support and personal connection were replaced by formal interactions that maintained institutional dignity at the expense of human warmth. The grandchildren who had known Charles as a loving grandfather found themselves relating to him as subjects of the crown. The man who had once played games with them, told them stories, and shared his passions for environmental conservation and traditional crafts was now a figure of constitutional authority who had to maintain appropriate distance even from his own family members. The security requirements that surrounded every family interaction created additional barriers to normal relationships. Charles's children and grandchildren couldn't simply drop by for impromptu visits, every family gathering required advanced security clearance, coordination with protection officers, and approval from officials who prioritized institutional requirements over personal preferences. The family photographs that had once captured genuine moments of affection and connection became official portraits that were planned by communications specialists and designed to convey specific messages about the monarchy's stability and continuity. Charles couldn't simply enjoy candid moments with his family. Every family interaction was potentially a public relations opportunity that had to be managed according to official protocols. The family's private communications were subject to the same security oversight that governed all of Charles's interactions. Phone calls between father and children were monitored by intelligence services, emails were processed through secure systems, and even text messages were subject to official scrutiny. The casual communication that had once sustained family relationships was transformed into formal correspondence that felt more like diplomatic exchanges than personal conversations. The financial aspects of royal life created additional complications for family relationships. Charles couldn't simply provide financial support to family members without consideration of how such support might be interpreted by Parliament, the press, and the public. The father's natural desire to help his children was constrained by constitutional requirements that treated royal finances as matters of public policy rather than private family decisions. The most painful realization for Charles was that his elevation to the throne had created exactly the kind of distance between himself and his family that he had tried to avoid throughout his years as heir apparent. He had watched his mother struggle with the balance between royal duty and maternal affection, and had promised himself that he would find ways to maintain close family relationships despite the demands of the crown. Instead, he discovered that the constitutional monarchy had evolved in ways that made such relationships increasingly difficult to sustain. The institution that his family had served for generations now demanded sacrifices that threatened the very family bonds that made service meaningful and worthwhile. The crown that represented his family's greatest achievement had become the source of his greatest personal loss. The role he had prepared for his entire life required him to sacrifice the relationships that gave his life meaning and purpose. The king who ruled over millions of subjects found himself increasingly isolated from the handful of people whose love and support had sustained him through decades of preparation for this moment. In the end, Charles realized that the crown hadn't just separated him from his palace, it had separated him from his family, creating a loneliness that no amount of public adoration or constitutional authority could fill. As the first year of his reign drew to a close, King Charles III stood once again at the window of Buckingham Palace, but now with a profound understanding of the price he had paid for wearing the crown. The palace that surrounded him represented not just the pinnacle of royal luxury but the most beautiful prison ever constructed, its golden bars forged from centuries of tradition, constitutional law, and the weight of institutional expectation. The realization had come gradually, through thousands of small moments that collectively revealed the true nature of modern monarchy. Each morning brought fresh evidence of how completely his personal identity had been subsumed into his constitutional role. The man who had once been Charles Philip Arthur George had become simply Your Majesty, a title that simultaneously elevated him above all other human beings and reduced him to a symbol whose personal desires were irrelevant to his public function. The constitutional requirements that governed every aspect of his existence weren't simply bureaucratic inconveniences but the fundamental framework within which British democracy functioned. Charles had discovered that the monarchy's survival depended not on the personal popularity or preferences of individual monarchs but on the institution's ability to transcend personal politics and individual personalities. This transcendence came at an enormous personal cost. Charles had to abandon not just his previous opinions and advocacy but his very identity as a thinking, feeling human being with personal preferences and individual desires. The environmental causes that had defined his public persona for decades were now off-limits because they represented political positions that could compromise the crown's constitutional neutrality. The architectural preservation projects that had brought him genuine satisfaction and personal fulfillment were now impossible because they might be interpreted as government policy statements. The organic farming initiatives that had reflected his deepest convictions about sustainability and land management were now potential sources of constitutional conflict that had to be carefully managed or abandoned altogether. The paradox of his position became clear through his daily interactions with government officials. As king, Charles was required to meet regularly with the Prime Minister, review legislation, and provide royal assent to parliamentary acts. Yet he was constitutionally prohibited from expressing personal opinions about any of these matters or influencing government policy in ways that reflected his individual preferences. This meant that Charles had to listen to briefings about environmental policies that contradicted his lifelong convictions, approve legislation that he personally opposed, and maintain ceremonial relationships with political leaders whose values were fundamentally different from his own. The king, who was supposedly the most powerful person in the nation, had no actual power to influence the decisions that would shape Britain's future. The international dimension of his role created additional layers of constraint and isolation. As head of state, Charles was required to maintain diplomatic relationships with foreign leaders regardless of his personal opinions about their policies or character. He had to welcome dictators and democrats with equal ceremonial dignity, host state dinners for leaders whose human rights records appalled him, and maintain the appearance of royal neutrality even when confronted with international conflicts that violated his deepest moral convictions. The Commonwealth responsibilities that came with the crown imposed additional obligations that separated Charles from normal human experience. As head of the Commonwealth, he was required to maintain relationships with dozens of nations whose political systems, cultural values, and economic interests were often incompatible with British policies or his personal beliefs. These relationships weren't simply ceremonial but involved real constitutional obligations that required Charles's attention and participation. Commonwealth meetings, state visits, and diplomatic initiatives consumed enormous amounts of time and energy while providing little opportunity for the kind of meaningful engagement with issues that had once given Charles's life purpose and direction. The media scrutiny that accompanied every aspect of royal life had intensified during Charles's reign in ways that made privacy impossible and authenticity dangerous. Every public appearance was analyzed for political implications. Every facial expression was interpreted as a statement about government policy, and every interaction with members of the public was scrutinized for evidence of personal opinions that might compromise the crown's constitutional position. This level of scrutiny meant that Charles had to become an actor playing the role of king rather than simply being himself in a public position. Every gesture was calculated, every word was scripted, and every emotion was filtered through the requirements of royal dignity and constitutional propriety. The spontaneity and authenticity that had made him an effective advocate for causes he believed in were now liabilities that could create constitutional crises. The financial constraints of royal life proved more limiting than Charles had anticipated. While the crown enjoyed enormous wealth in terms of palaces, art collections, and historical artifacts, the king's personal freedom to spend money was severely restricted by parliamentary oversight and public accountability requirements. Charles couldn't simply donate money to causes he supported without considering how such donations might be interpreted as political statements. He couldn't make personal investments that might create conflicts of interest with government policies. He couldn't even make substantial personal purchases without considering how such expenses might be perceived by taxpayers who ultimately funded the monarchy through the crown estate and parliamentary grants. The most profound loss was the transformation of his relationship with time itself. As Prince of Wales, Charles had been able to plan long-term projects that reflected his personal interests and values. As king, his schedule was entirely determined by constitutional obligations and state requirements that left no room for personal initiative or individual preference. The red boxes that arrived daily contained not just government documents requiring his attention but his entire future, planned months or years in advance by officials who prioritized constitutional necessity over personal satisfaction. Charles discovered that he had traded his autonomy for a crown that gave him everything except the freedom to choose how to spend his remaining years on earth. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on him. The institution that his family had served for generations in order to preserve British democracy and constitutional government had evolved into a system that denied basic democratic freedoms to the very person who symbolized those freedoms to the world. Charles couldn't vote in elections, couldn't express political opinions, couldn't participate in public debates about the issues that would determine Britain's future, and couldn't use his position to advocate for causes he believed in. The king who represented British freedom was the least free person in the kingdom, constrained by constitutional requirements that made ordinary citizens' rights and privileges impossible for him to enjoy. The realization that shaped Charles's understanding of his predicament wasn't bitterness about personal sacrifice but acceptance of historical necessity. The British monarchy had survived and evolved over centuries precisely because individual monarchs had been willing to subordinate their personal desires to institutional requirements. His mother's long reign had demonstrated that royal service required the gradual erasure of personal identity in favor of constitutional symbolism. Queen Elizabeth II had succeeded as a monarch by becoming less human and more institutional with each passing year, until she represented not a person but an idea about British continuity and democratic tradition. Charles understood that his own success as king would require the same transformation. The man who had spent decades developing strong opinions and passionate convictions would have to become a neutral symbol whose personal thoughts and feelings were irrelevant to his public function. The palace that surrounded him would never be his home because home implied personal choice, individual preference, and the freedom to live according to one's own values and desires. The crown had given him the most magnificent residence in the world and simultaneously made it impossible for him to experience it as anything more than a workplace where he performed the role of king for audiences that would judge his performance according to standards he could never fully understand or control. As the evening shadows lengthened across the palace grounds, Charles reflected on the price of constitutional monarchy in the modern age. The crown had given him everything that his birth had promised and taken away everything that made life meaningful on a human level. He had achieved his destiny and lost himself in the process, becoming the latest in a long line of monarchs who had discovered that wearing the crown meant abandoning the right to be fully human. The gilded cage that surrounded him was beautiful beyond description and inescapable beyond imagination. King Charles III had finally come home to Buckingham Palace, only to discover that home was now the one place in the world where he could never truly belong.